I was 40 years old the last time I saw both of my daughters in the same room. That was October 11th, 1985, a Friday, and they were arguing about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. Trivial, meaningless, the kind of fight that happens in every household in America. But I have replayed that argument in my mind 10,000 times because it was the last ordinary moment of my life. By Sunday morning, both of my girls were gone, and the world I understood had been replaced by something I still struggle to describe, even now, 40 years later. My name is Carol Dawson. I was a registered nurse at St. Joseph's Community Hospital in Clearfield, Pennsylvania for 31 years. I raised my daughters mostly on my own after their father, Jim, passed from a cardiac event in 1982. He was 43, strong as a draft horse one day, gone the next. That loss shaped everything that came after because it bound those two girls together in a way that went beyond normal sisterhood. They became each other's anchors. Where you found one, you found the other. That's why when they disappeared, nothing about it made sense. They wouldn't have separated, they wouldn't have run away, and they certainly wouldn't have gone into those woods voluntarily after dark. But they did. Let me back up and tell you about my girls. Diane was 19, the older one, and she was finishing her second year at the community college, studying to be a dental hygienist, practical, steady, always thinking 2 steps ahead. She had Jim's jaw and my stubbornness. Her sister Connie was 16, a junior at Clearfield Area High School, and she was the opposite in almost every way. Creative, impulsive. She drew constantly, filled notebook after notebook with sketches of animals, trees, landscapes. She wanted to be an illustrator for National Geographic, which at the time seemed like the most impossible dream a girl from central Pennsylvania could have. But Connie didn't care about impossible. That was always the difference between them. Diane lived inside the lines. Connie didn't believe lines existed. The weekend they disappeared was supposed to be unremarkable. I was working the Saturday overnight shift at the hospital, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Diane was staying home to study for an anatomy exam. Connie was supposed to be at her friend Tammy Briggs's house for a sleepover. That was the plan. Simple, safe. Except Connie never went to Tammy's house, and Diane never opened her anatomy textbook. I found out what actually happened in fragments over years, and some of it I'm still piecing together, but here's what I know for certain. At approximately 4:30 on Saturday afternoon, October 12th, Connie came home from school and told Diane she'd found something in the woods. Not something vague, something specific. She said she'd found a structure deep in the state forest land that bordered our property, about 3 miles in past the old fire road. She described it as a shelter made from woven branches, enormous, tall enough to stand inside, with a doorway that faced away from the prevailing wind. She said the interior was lined with dried moss and strips of bark, and that there were bones arranged in patterns on the ground near the entrance. Diane's reaction, according to what she later told a search volunteer, was immediate dismissal. She assumed Connie had found an old hunting blind or maybe some survivalist's camp. The bones were probably deer carcasses, nothing unusual for that part of the Allegheny Plateau. But Connie insisted this was different. She said the structure was too large, too deliberate, too carefully made, and she said there was a smell around it that she couldn't identify, something musky and deep that reminded her of wet leather mixed with rotting fruit. She wanted Diane to come see it before the light faded. Diane said no. She had studying to do. She told Connie to stay home, forget about it, and go to Tammy's house as planned. But Connie had a way of wearing people down. She'd stand in a doorway and talk. Just keep talking, circling back, finding new angles, new arguments, new reasons, why whatever she wanted was reasonable and everything else was boring. By 5:15, Diane had closed her textbook and laced up her hiking boots. By 5:30, they were walking into the tree line behind our house, with a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and absolutely no understanding of what they were walking toward. I want to be clear about something. My family was not unfamiliar with the woods. Jim had hunted that forest every fall since before we were married. I'd hiked those trails with the girls every summer. We knew the terrain, the landmarks, the seasonal patterns of the wildlife. Clearfield County is not wilderness in the way people from cities imagine wilderness. It's working forest, logging country, crisscrossed with old skid roads and utility corridors. People live in and around it. They hunt it, fish its streams, ride ATVs through it on weekends. It is not the kind of place where two young women should vanish without a trace, but that is exactly what happened. When I came home from my shift at 7:15 Sunday morning, the house was empty. Diane's anatomy textbook was on the kitchen table, closed, with a coffee mug sitting on top of it. Connie's school bag was by the back door. Both pairs of hiking boots were missing from the mudroom. I didn't panic immediately. Diane was an adult, and I assumed they'd gotten up early and gone for a walk. I showered, made breakfast, and waited. By noon, I started calling. No answer at Tammy Briggs's house. Diane's boyfriend at the time, a boy named Greg Pollard, hadn't heard from her since Friday. I called 3 neighbors. Nobody had seen them. At 2 p.m., I walked out to the tree line and shouted their names until my voice cracked. The forest gave me nothing back except the sound of jays. I called the Clearfield County Sheriff's Office at 3:22 p.m. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock above the phone and thought, this is the moment everything changes. I was right, but not in any way I could have predicted. The search began Monday morning. 14 volunteers, 2 sheriff's deputies, and a dog handler from Dubois. They covered the first 2 miles of forest in a grid pattern, found nothing, and expanded outward. By Tuesday, the state police had joined. By Wednesday, there were 47 people combing those woods. They found the fire road Connie had mentioned. They found deer trails, old logging cuts, a collapsed root cellar from some forgotten homestead. They found a single boot print in dried mud near a creek crossing about 2.5 miles from our property. Size 7. Diane wore a 7. That was the only physical evidence recovered in the first 2 weeks. I walked those search lines every day. My supervisor at the hospital, a woman named Donna Price, who'd been charge nurse on the medical floor for 20 years, told me to take as much time as I needed. The other nurses covered my shifts without being asked. That's how Clearfield works. When something happens to one of your own, the town closes around you like a fist. People brought food to my house, casseroles and sheet cakes, and foil trays of baked ziti, until the refrigerator couldn't hold any more and I started stacking containers on the porch. The Presbyterian Church held a prayer vigil on the second Wednesday. Tammy Briggs's mother called me every morning at 7 to ask if there was news. There never was. The dog handler was a quiet man named Steve Lutz, who worked with a German shepherd named Ranger. I watched that dog work the area around the creek crossing where they'd found the boot print. Ranger picked up a scent trail and followed it northwest for about 300 yards, pulling hard on the lead, ears flat, moving with purpose. Then he stopped. Not gradually, the way a dog loses a trail, abruptly like he'd walked into a wall. He sat down, looked back at Steve, and whined. Steve tried to redirect him 3 times. Each time, Ranger returned to the same spot and refused to go further. Steve told the deputy the dog was indicating a terminus, meaning the scent trail simply ended, as if whoever made it had been lifted off the ground. The deputy wrote it down and nobody mentioned it again. But I remembered. I also remembered what happened on the 9th day of the search, when a volunteer named Tom Archer came out of the forest about 2 hours before dark looking pale and shaken. Tom was a big man, a mechanic at the Mack truck dealership on Route 322, the kind of person who fixed diesel engines with his bare hands and never worried about much of anything. But that afternoon he walked up to the search coordinator's table with his hands trembling and said he'd heard something in a ravine about 3 miles north of the search perimeter. He described it as a scream, high-pitched and sustained, that didn't sound like any animal he knew. He said it came from at least 2 sources, one high and one low, and that they seemed to be communicating, alternating their calls in a pattern that felt deliberate. The coordinator, a state trooper named Kevin Walsh, noted it in the log as possible wildlife activity, likely a mountain lion or a barred owl. Tom looked at me across the table and shook his head slightly. Whatever he'd heard, he knew it wasn't an owl. The theories started immediately, the way they always do when young women go missing. Someone took them, they ran away. A boyfriend was involved, drugs were involved. I listened to every theory and dismissed each one, not out of a mother's denial, but out of factual knowledge. My daughters did not use drugs. They were not involved with anyone dangerous. They had no reason to run. Their savings accounts were untouched. Their social security cards were in my filing cabinet. Every piece of identification they owned was still in the house. Something in those woods had swallowed them whole, and no one could explain it. The search was officially suspended after 19 days. I was told this was standard procedure for a case with no leads. The file remained open, but active searching stopped. I remember sitting in my kitchen that night, staring at Diane's anatomy textbook, still on the table, and making a decision that would define the next 3 decades of my life. I was going to find my girls, myself, or I was going to die trying. Over the following months, I became something I never intended to be. I became an investigator, not a professional one, just a mother with a wall calendar, a county map, and an obsessive need to understand what had happened. I talked to every hunter, hiker, trapper, and forest worker I could find. I asked the same questions over and over. Had they seen anything unusual? Had they heard anything? Had they noticed structures in the deep woods that didn't belong there? Most people gave me sympathetic looks and vague answers. A few told me about strange sounds at night, deep vocalizations that didn't match any known animal. One old-timer named Walt Hendricks, who'd trapped that forest for 50 years, sat me down at his kitchen table in January of 1986 and said something I didn't know how to process at the time. He said, "Carol, there are things in those woods that have been there longer than us. I've seen sign of them my whole life. Big tracks, twisted trees, shelters that aren't human-made. I don't talk about it because people think you're crazy, but if your girls found one of those shelters, they found something most people never see." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "I mean they're out there. The big ones, the forest people, whatever you want to call them. They've been in these mountains since before the lumber companies came, before the Seneca, before anyone, and they don't like being found." Walt Hendricks was 81 years old, a deacon at his church, a Korean War veteran, and the most plain-spoken man I'd ever met. He was not a crackpot. He was not a storyteller. He said what he saw, and he kept his mouth shut about the rest. So when he told me something lived in those woods that wasn't human and wasn't animal, I didn't laugh. I wrote it down. And I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. Through the spring and summer of 1986, I hiked into that forest every Saturday and Sunday that weather permitted. I marked my routes on the county map. I photographed anything unusual, broken branches at heights no deer could reach, ground depressions that looked like enormous footprints filled with rainwater, trees with bark stripped in spiraling patterns that didn't match any woodpecker damage I'd ever seen. I found 3 more structures over the course of that summer. Each one was similar to what Connie had described: large dome-shaped frameworks of interlocked branches, positioned in sheltered locations away from established trails. 2 of them showed signs of recent use: fresh bedding material, animal bones with meat still clinging to them, and that same musky smell Connie had mentioned, the one like wet leather and overripe fruit. There was one Saturday in July of that summer that I will never forget as long as I live. I was about 3.5 miles in, following a game trail along the south side of a ridge, when I came to a clearing I hadn't visited before. It was a natural opening in the canopy, maybe 40 feet across, where a large oak had fallen and taken several smaller trees with it. The downed timber had been rearranged. That's the only way I can describe it. Logs that should have been lying where they fell had been moved, stacked, repositioned into a rough semicircle around the clearing's edge. Some of them weighed hundreds of pounds. No human could have moved them without equipment, and there were no tire tracks, no drag marks from chains, no evidence that machinery had ever been within miles of this spot. Something had picked those logs up and placed them deliberately, creating what looked like seating or a boundary, or both. In the center of the clearing, the ground had been swept clean, not raked, not cleared with tools, swept as if enormous hands had brushed away the leaf litter and forest debris to expose the bare earth underneath. And on that bare earth, arranged in a circle about 6 feet in diameter, were stones. River stones, smooth and round, each one roughly the size of a grapefruit, placed at regular intervals with a precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. There were 17 of them. I counted twice. 17 stones in a perfect circle on swept ground in the middle of a clearing where something had rearranged fallen timber like furniture. I stood at the edge of that clearing for 10 minutes without moving. The forest around me was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the leaves. That kind of silence doesn't happen naturally in a Pennsylvania forest in July. Something had caused every living thing in the area to go quiet, and the most likely explanation was that something large was nearby, and every creature with survival instincts knew it. I took 4 photographs, backed away slowly, and didn't return to that particular spot for 3 months. When I did return in October, the stones were gone. Every single one. The clearing looked like an ordinary forest opening, unremarkable in every way, as if the whole arrangement had never existed. I showed my photographs to a wildlife biologist at Penn State's Extension office. He told me the structures were probably bear dens, which I knew was wrong because I'd seen bear dens, and they looked nothing like this. These were engineered, intentional. The branches were woven, not piled. The doorways were oriented with purpose. Whatever built them understood wind direction, drainage, and concealment in ways that spoke to intelligence, not instinct. By the fall of '86, 1 year after my daughters vanished, I had accumulated a thick folder of photographs, sketches, and notes. I had spoken to 37 people who reported unusual experiences in the forests of Clearfield and Elk counties. 11 of those people described seeing large bipedal figures moving through the trees at distances too great for positive identification. 6 described hearing vocalizations, howls, screams, and a deep rhythmic knocking sound that they could not attribute to any known source. 3 described finding footprints measuring between 16 and 21 inches in length. I was not looking for Bigfoot. I need you to understand that. I was looking for my daughters. But the trail kept leading me towards something I had never believed in and had never had reason to consider. The evidence I was gathering pointed toward the presence of an unknown primate species living in the deep forests of the Allegheny Plateau, and somehow my girls had stumbled into their territory. The next 7 years were the hardest of my life. I worked my shifts at the hospital, came home, and spent every available hour either in the woods or reviewing my notes. I lost weight, I stopped socializing. My sister, Barb, drove down from Erie once a month to make sure I was eating. The people in town were kind but increasingly worried about me. I could see it in their faces, the way they'd touch my arm at the grocery store and say, "How are you doing, Carol?" with that particular emphasis on the doing that meant they thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was, but I was also finding things that couldn't be explained away. In the summer of 1988, I found a cache. That's the only word for it. A deliberate storage site located in a rock overhang about 4 miles from my property, deeper into the forest than I'd previously explored. The overhang formed a natural shelf about 8 feet off the ground, and on that shelf, arranged with obvious care, were objects: a rusted coffee can, 3 glass bottles, the old-style returnable kind from a bottling plant that had closed in the 70s, a length of nylon rope knotted at intervals, a child's rubber ball, faded pink, and a hairbrush. I recognized the hairbrush immediately. It was a Goody brand with a mint green handle, and it had belonged to Connie. I had bought it for her at the McCrory's in downtown Clearfield the previous Christmas. I stood in that forest looking at my daughter's hairbrush, sitting on a rock shelf 8 feet above my head, surrounded by collected objects that had no business being there, and something shifted inside me. The grief, which had been a constant roaring presence for 3 years, went quiet. In its place came a strange, terrible clarity. My daughters were alive. Someone or something had taken them. And that something collected objects the way a crow collects shiny things, with curiosity rather than purpose. I took the hairbrush. I left everything else. And I went home and sat on the porch until dark, turning that brush over in my hands, trying to understand a world where a creature could exist that was intelligent enough to build shelters, collect objects, and apparently keep 2 young women, yet remain completely unknown to modern science. The following spring, 1989, I started leaving things at the cache site. Small gifts, apples which disappeared within hours, colorful scarves which also disappeared. Once a small hand mirror, the kind you'd find at a drugstore. That one I found moved to a different location about 50 yards away, propped against a tree at an angle where it caught the morning sun and threw light across the forest floor. Something had not only taken it, but positioned it with aesthetic consideration. That detail occupied my thoughts more than almost anything else. Through the late 80s and into the 90s, I continued this exchange. I left items. They disappeared or were moved. Occasionally, I found things left in return, though I couldn't be certain they were intended for me. A bundle of turkey feathers tied with a strip of bark, a smooth river stone with a natural hole through its center. Once, a pile of hazelnuts stacked in a pyramid so precise that no wind could have arranged them. I told no one about the exchanges, not my sister, not my co-workers, not the sheriff's office. I knew how it would be received, but the exchanges felt sacred to me, like a conversation conducted in a language neither party fully understood. I was talking to something, and it was talking back. The question that consumed me, the one that kept me awake at 3 a.m. and turned my hair white before I was 50, was simple. Where were my daughters? Were they with these creatures? Were they alive? Were they being held against their will? And if so, why hadn't they tried to come home? By 1992, 7 years after the disappearance, the official case was ice cold. The sheriff's department had a new sheriff who'd never met my girls. The state police had archived the file. The only person still actively looking was me, and I was running out of ideas. My health was declining. Decades of night shifts, poor sleep, and weekend hikes through rough terrain had worn me down. I had developed arthritis in both knees and a persistent cough that my doctor wanted to investigate further. Barb told me I looked 10 years older than I was. She wasn't wrong. I had also begun to experience something I couldn't explain medically or psychologically, a feeling of being watched. Not the casual paranoia of someone spending too much time alone in the woods, but a specific directional awareness, a certainty that something was observing me from a fixed position among the trees. It happened every time I visited the cache site, and it had started happening closer to home, at the tree line behind my property, sometimes as close as the edge of my backyard. I bought a camera, a decent 35mm with a telephoto lens, from the Sears catalog. I started photographing the tree line at different times of day. Most of the images showed nothing: trees, shadows, the ordinary architecture of a Pennsylvania forest. But 3 photographs taken over a span of 4 months in the fall of '92 showed something that made me sit down on my kitchen floor and weep. In the background of each photo, partially obscured by foliage but unmistakably present, was a large, dark figure standing upright among the trees. The proportions were wrong for a bear. The posture was wrong for a human. In one photograph, taken in late November when the leaves had dropped and the sightlines were longer, I could make out what appeared to be a second, smaller figure standing beside the first. They were watching my house. They had been watching my house. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, the photographs spread on the table, and tried to reason through what I was seeing. These creatures, whatever they were, had been monitoring me. They knew where I lived. They knew my patterns. They had been close enough to observe me for years, possibly since before the girls disappeared. And if they were watching me, if they were that close and that aware, then the exchanges at the cache site were not random. They were intentional communication from beings who understood reciprocity, which meant they understood relationships. They understood that I was connected to those 2 girls, and they had chosen for 7 years to keep my daughters from me. The anger that rose in me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was clean and cold and total. I had spent 7 years grieving, searching, leaving gifts like offerings at an altar, and these things had been right there the whole time, close enough to touch, close enough to bring my girls home. And they hadn't. I did something reckless. I went to the cache site the next Saturday, and instead of leaving an apple or a scarf, I left a note. I wrote it on a piece of cardstock in large block letters, and it said, "I know you have my daughters. Bring them home, please." I didn't know if they could read. I didn't know if they'd understand, but I had exhausted every rational approach, and desperation makes you do things that logic never would. The note was gone within 24 hours. In its place was a single object that stopped me cold. It was a drawing, a piece of birch bark, roughly 8 inches by 6 inches, with images scratched into the surface using what appeared to be a sharp stone or a thorn. The images depicted 2 human figures standing among much larger figures, 4 of them, in what looked like a forest setting. The human figures were smaller but not restrained. They were standing freely. One of them appeared to be holding something, a bundle or a basket. The other had her arms extended, as if reaching toward one of the larger figures. I stared at that piece of birch bark for an hour, sitting on the forest floor with tears streaming, because I knew with a certainty that transcended evidence or logic that my daughter had made this drawing. Connie had always drawn. She drew everything. She drew the way other people breathed, and something in the way those figures were rendered, the proportions, the gestural quality of the lines, the attention to how bodies occupied space, was unmistakably her hand. My 16-year-old daughter, who had been missing for 7 years, was alive. She was somewhere in this forest, and she had drawn me a picture to prove it. The months that followed were the most focused period of my entire search. I returned to the cache site every 3 days, leaving notes and receiving responses. Not all responses were drawings. Some were arrangements of objects, stones, and sticks, positioned in patterns I couldn't interpret. Some were plant materials, bundles of herbs or flowers left in specific combinations, but approximately once every 2 weeks, a new drawing appeared, always on birch bark, always scratched with the same careful hand. The drawings told a story, though it took me months to piece it together. They showed the two human figures living among the larger ones, sleeping in structures, eating around a central area, walking through forest. One drawing showed a human figure with her hand on the chest of a smaller version of the larger creatures, a child-sized figure, and the tenderness in that image was so vivid that I had to set it down and walk away before I could look at it again. My daughters were not prisoners. That was what the drawings were telling me. They were participants, members, somehow, of a family group that was not human. And at least one of them, the one who was drawing, was communicating with me because she wanted me to know they were safe. Not coming home, but safe. I could not accept that. A mother cannot accept that her children have chosen to live in the woods with creatures that science says don't exist. I couldn't accept that Diane, practical, sensible Diane, had willingly abandoned her education, her career plans, her entire human life. I couldn't accept that Connie, my artist, my dreamer, had given up on National Geographic to scratch pictures on tree bark in a forest in central Pennsylvania. None of it made sense, but the drawings kept coming, and the story they told kept growing more complex, more detailed, more impossible to dismiss. By the spring of 1993, I had accumulated 47 birch bark drawings. Together they depicted an entire way of life, seasonal migration patterns, communal food preparation, what appeared to be teaching, the larger figures demonstrating tasks to smaller ones while the human figures watched or participated. One remarkable drawing showed one of the human figures sitting on a fallen log, with a small creature beside her, and the human was clearly drawing in the dirt with a stick while the small creature watched. Connie was teaching. She was teaching art to a Sasquatch child. That drawing broke something open in me, not my heart, which had been broken so many times it was held together with scar tissue and stubbornness. What broke open was my understanding. I finally grasped, sitting there in the woods with that piece of bark in my hands, that my daughter had not been taken. She had been found. She had stumbled into a world that most people would never see, and she had recognized it as home in a way she never had in Clearfield. The girl who drew everything, who filled notebooks with animals and trees, who dreamed of illustrating the natural world for a living, had discovered the most extraordinary natural world imaginable, and she had chosen it. That realization didn't come easily, and it didn't arrive clean. It was wrapped in guilt, because if Connie had chosen this life, then part of the reason she chose it was that the life I'd provided hadn't been enough. The small house with the leaky faucet and the peeling wallpaper in the hallway. The town where everybody knew your business and nobody let you forget your father's death. The future that offered dental hygiene school and a secretarial pool and marriage to a boy from Clearfield who'd worked the same mill his father worked until the mill closed or his back gave out. I had given my daughters a practical life, a safe life, and Connie had looked at it and walked away. She had looked at a family of creatures living in the deep woods with nothing but bark and bone and sky, and she had chosen them. I wrestled with that understanding through the winter of '93 and into '94. I kept going to the cache site. I kept leaving notes, though my notes had changed. I no longer demanded my daughter's return. Instead, I wrote about ordinary things. The weather, what I'd planted in the garden, how the hospital had gotten new equipment for the emergency department. I wrote the way you'd write to a child at summer camp. Casual updates that said, "I'm still here, I still love you, the world you left behind is still turning." And then, one morning, in April of 1994, I found something at the cache site that inverted everything I thought I'd understood. It was a note, not a drawing, not an arrangement of objects. A note written in English, in handwriting I recognized as surely as I recognized my own face. It was Diane's handwriting, small, precise, slanted slightly to the left, the way it always had because she was left-handed and nobody had taught her to compensate. The note was written on a piece of fabric, what looked like a torn section of a cotton shirt, using something dark, charcoal or berry juice. I couldn't tell. And it said 5 words that reorganized my entire understanding of the previous 9 years. Mom, I want to come home. 5 words, 21 letters, and 3 periods. I held that piece of fabric against my chest and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. Diane wanted to come home. She was alive. She could write. She remembered English. She remembered me, and she wanted to come home. After 9 years of silence, 9 years of communicating only through Connie's drawings and the wordless exchanges at the cache site, my older daughter had reached out directly and asked for rescue. I didn't go home that day. I sat at the cache site until dark, which was dangerous and foolish, and I didn't care. I sat there because I wanted them to see me. I wanted whatever was watching from the trees to understand that I had received the message and I was not leaving. When the light faded completely and the temperature dropped below freezing, I walked home by flashlight, every sense electrified, scanning the darkness for shapes and movement. I heard something paralleling me through the trees about 60 yards to my left. Heavy footfalls, deliberate and measured, matching my pace exactly. It followed me all the way to the tree line behind my property, and then it stopped. I stood on my back porch, shaking from cold and adrenaline, staring into the black wall of the forest, and whispered, "Bring her home." I wrote a response that night. I wrote, "Diane, I'm here. Tell me what you need. Tell me how. I love you." I brought it to the cache site at dawn. By afternoon, it was gone. What followed was a correspondence that lasted 11 months, conducted entirely through notes left at the cache site. Diane wrote in fragments, never more than a few sentences at a time, always on scraps of fabric using natural pigments. The writing was sometimes smudged, sometimes barely legible, but always unmistakably hers. She told me things in those notes that I have never shared with anyone until now, and some of them I will carry to my grave because they are not mine to tell. But the essential story, the one that explains what you're listening to right now, I can share. Diane told me they had found the structure that Saturday evening in October of '85, just as Connie had described. What Connie had not mentioned, or what Diane hadn't believed until she saw it herself, was that the structure was occupied, not when they arrived, but shortly after. As the sisters were examining the interior, something came back to it, something enormous, something that stood in the doorway and blocked out the remaining sky. Diane described the terror of that first moment as something beyond fear. She said it was like every cell in her body tried to leave her skeleton simultaneously. She said she couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't process what she was seeing. Connie, standing beside her, did something inexplicable. She stepped forward, not away, not sideways, forward, toward the creature in the doorway, and she made a sound, a low humming sound, the same sound she used to make when she was drawing and didn't realize anyone was listening. And the creature responded. It tilted its head, the way a dog tilts its head when it hears something interesting, and it produced a sound in return. Not a growl, not a roar, a rumble, deep and resonant, that Diane said she felt in her sternum more than heard with her ears. What happened over the following hours, I don't have the space to recount in complete detail. The essential version is that more of them arrived. A family group, Diane estimated 4 adults and 2 juveniles, though it was hard to count in the dark. They surrounded the sisters but did not touch them. They communicated among themselves in a complex series of vocalizations, gestures, and what Diane described as chest vibrations. low-frequency sounds produced by beating their open palms against their sternums in rhythmic patterns. Connie, who had always been sensitive to sound and rhythm, began imitating these patterns. The creatures responded with visible excitement, passing glances among themselves and increasing the frequency of their own vocalizations. By morning, the sisters had not been harmed. They had been watched closely and continuously, but not restrained. Food had been offered, roots and nuts and strips of dried meat that Diane refused but Connie accepted. And Connie had made a connection. There's no other word for it. She had established communication, basic but genuine, with the largest of the adults, a female who stood close to 7 feet tall and moved with a grace that contradicted her size. By dawn, the two of them were sitting side by side, while Connie scratched images in the dirt, and the creature watched with an intensity that Diane found more unsettling than the initial encounter. Diane wanted to leave. She told me this clearly in her notes. She wanted to leave that first morning, walk out of the forest, go home, call the authorities, and pretend none of it had happened. But Connie refused. She said they'd stumbled onto something the world had never documented, and leaving would mean losing it forever. She begged Diane to stay one more day, just one more day. That one day became two became a week. The creatures moved camp, and the sisters moved with them, deeper into forest that Diane no longer recognized. By the time Diane seriously attempted to leave on her own, she couldn't find her way back. The terrain had changed. The landmarks she remembered were gone, replaced by unfamiliar ridgelines and valleys she'd never seen. And by the time she admitted this to Connie, Connie didn't want to go back at all. She was already learning their language, already sketching them in the dirt, already part of something that filled her in a way our small-town life never had. Diane's practical, sensible older daughter was still looking over her shoulder toward the world they'd left, but Connie had turned her face fully toward this new one and never looked back. The correspondence with Diane continued through the spring and summer of 1994, and with each note, I assembled a clearer picture of the 9 years my daughters had spent in the forest. Diane's accounts were clinical, precise, the observations of a woman who had trained in anatomy and thought in systems. She described their daily life with the family group in terms that read almost like field notes, which I think was her way of maintaining her sanity. If she framed it as observation rather than experience, she could keep some distance between herself and the reality of what her life had become. The group consisted of 7 individuals when the sisters first encountered them. The dominant male, whom Connie had apparently named Gray because of a broad streak of silver hair running from his temples down his back, stood approximately 7.5 feet tall and weighed, by Diane's estimate, somewhere north of 500 pounds. His mate, the female Connie had first connected with, was slightly shorter but broader through the shoulders. Diane called her Big Mama in her notes, and despite Diane's clinical tone, I could read the affection underneath. Big Mama had been the one to first offer food. Big Mama had been the one to guide the sisters to a sleeping area their first night. Big Mama had been the one who, when Diane wept from fear and exhaustion that first week, sat beside her and placed an enormous hand on her back, with a pressure so gentle that Diane said it felt like being held by the earth itself. There were 2 adolescents, a juvenile male and female that Diane estimated were the equivalent of human teenagers, and a small one, a toddler of sorts, who was the child that appeared in Connie's drawings. Over the years, 2 more young had been born, bringing the group to 9. The sisters had witnessed both births, and Diane described them in her notes with the awe of someone who had studied biology but never imagined applying that knowledge to a species undocumented by science. Their diet was omnivorous and seasonal. Spring meant fresh greens, tubers, and eggs raided from ground-nesting birds. Summer brought berries, fish caught by hand from shallow streams, and occasionally small mammals. Fall was harvest season, nuts, late fruits, the last of the root vegetables before the ground hardened. Winter was the lean time, when the group relied on cached food, dried meat, and bark stripped from certain species of trees that Diane said had a starchy, fibrous quality when chewed. The sisters ate what the group ate. There was no alternative. Diane lost 30 pounds in the first year and then stabilized as her body adapted. Connie, always slight, became wiry and hard, in ways that Diane said made her look 10 years older than she was. They moved with the seasons, following a route that Diane eventually mapped in her memory, a rough circuit through the deep valleys and high ridges of the Allegheny Plateau that repeated annually with minor variations. Winter camps were low, sheltered, positioned near south-facing rock walls that absorbed heat from whatever thin sunlight penetrated the canopy. Summer camps were higher, on ridgelines where breezes kept the insects manageable, and sightlines allowed the group to monitor the surrounding territory. The entire circuit covered, by Diane's estimate, roughly 40 miles, but it rarely brought them within 2 miles of any road, trail, or human habitation. This was deliberate. The creatures understood human territory the way a chess player understands the board. They knew where the roads were, where the houses were, where the hunters walked in November, where the loggers worked in spring. They adjusted their movements to avoid all of it. Gray, the dominant male, would sometimes disappear for hours and return with information that altered the group's route. A new logging operation here, a hunting camp there. Diane believed he conducted reconnaissance, moving silently through territory that humans considered their own, cataloging our activities the way we might catalog the movements of wildlife. The irony was not lost on her. Communication was the most remarkable aspect of their existence, and the area where Connie had thrived beyond anything Diane could have predicted. Their language, and Diane insisted it was a language, not merely vocalizations, operated on multiple channels simultaneously. There were sounds, a vocabulary of distinct calls, clicks, and tonal variations that Diane estimated numbered in the hundreds. There were gestures, specific positions of hands, arms, and head that modified or clarified the vocal elements, and there were the infrasonic vibrations, the chest-beating patterns that carried emotional content, the way tone of voice carries emotion in human speech. Connie had learned to produce and interpret all 3 channels. By the time Diane began writing to me, Connie was functionally fluent. She could communicate complex ideas, express preferences, make requests, tell stories. She could argue with Gray about travel routes and win. Diane's own communication remained limited. She understood more than she could produce, following conversations the way someone with 2 years of high school Spanish might follow a rapid exchange in Madrid, catching the gist, missing the nuance. She attributed this partly to temperament and partly to choice. Connie had leaned into this world with everything she had. Diane had kept one foot in the human world, mentally if not physically, and that resistance had cost her linguistic progress. But it had preserved something else. It had preserved her identity. After 9 years, Connie was more creature than human in many ways. She moved like them, low and fluid and silent. She slept in the open when weather permitted, curled against Big Mama's side the way the juvenile females did. She ate with her hands without hesitation, cracking bones for marrow and chewing bark with evident satisfaction. She had stopped wearing clothes in the warmer months, her body hair having thickened considerably over the years in response to constant exposure. She communicated primarily in their language, reverting to English only with Diane, and even then mixing in gestures and vocalizations that Diane sometimes struggled to interpret. Diane, by contrast, had maintained every human habit she could. She wore what remained of her clothing until it fell apart. then constructed rough garments from deer hide that Big Mama helped her prepare. She spoke English aloud to herself every day, conjugating verbs, reciting Bible passages she'd memorized in Sunday school, narrating her observations in complete sentences so that the language wouldn't atrophy. She kept a mental calendar, tracking days and seasons and years with obsessive precision. She marked the anniversaries. Every October 12th, the date they'd walked into the forest, Diane sat apart from the group and spent the day in silence. These differences between my daughters had always existed, but 9 years in the forest had amplified them into what amounted to 2 entirely different experiences of the same decade. Connie was home. Diane was in exile, and the longer Diane remained, the more impossible return became, because the only way out of the forest required either finding her own path, which she'd failed at repeatedly, or being guided out by the creatures who showed no inclination to let either sister leave. That was the central question I kept returning to in our correspondence. Why wouldn't they let Diane leave? If Connie had chosen to stay, fine, that was Connie's decision, agonizing as it was for me to accept. But Diane hadn't chosen this. Diane was being kept, not cruelly, not in chains or behind bars, but kept nonetheless. The way you'd keep a family member who wanted to do something you believed was dangerous. The creatures didn't restrain Diane physically, but whenever she moved in the direction of human territory, one or more of them would position themselves in her path. Not aggressively, just present. A wall of muscle and purpose standing between her and the direction she wanted to go. And Diane, practical as she was, understood that arguing with something that outweighed her by 400 pounds was not a proposition she could win. In her notes, Diane described one particular attempt to leave in the winter of 1990, about 5 years in. She had waited for a night when the group was sleeping, the adults in their characteristic positions surrounding the young, creating a ring of body heat against the cold. She had crept out of the shelter, moved silently through the snow, following a creek downstream because she knew creeks eventually led to rivers and rivers eventually led to roads. She made it perhaps half a mile before she heard Gray behind her, not chasing, walking, his footsteps unhurried, his breathing calm. He simply walked up beside her, looked at her, and then looked back toward the camp. He didn't vocalize, he didn't gesture. He just stood there, enormous and patient, until Diane turned around and walked back. She said the worst part wasn't the failure. The worst part was the gentleness of it. He wasn't angry, he was concerned, the way a parent is concerned when a child wanders toward a busy road. That comparison stayed with me. These creatures saw my daughters as members of their family. Connie had been adopted eagerly, a willing participant who enriched the group with her creativity and communication abilities. Diane had been adopted reluctantly, a necessary addition because she came with Connie, and separating them would have caused distress to both. The creatures understood pair bonds. They understood that Diane and Connie were linked, and that breaking that link would cause harm. So they kept both, and they treated both with the same care they gave their own young, even when one of them clearly wanted to leave. The moral complexity of this still overwhelms me when I sit with it. These were not monsters. They were not kidnappers in any human sense of the word. They were beings operating according to their own social framework, one that prioritized group cohesion and mutual care above individual freedom. In their world, you didn't leave your family. Family was everything. The group was survival. A solitary individual was a dead individual. By keeping Diane, they weren't punishing her. They were protecting her by their own understanding from the most dangerous thing they could imagine, being alone. I grasped this intellectually. Emotionally, I wanted to tear that forest apart with my bare hands. The correspondence came to a sudden stop in March of 1995. I left a note and received nothing in return. I left another. Nothing. For 3 weeks, the cache site was untouched, my notes remaining exactly where I'd placed them. Panic doesn't begin to describe what I experienced. I hiked deeper into the forest than I ever had, past the cache site, past the structures I'd found years before, into terrain so remote and overgrown that I had to crawl through laurel thickets on my hands and knees. I found nothing, no sign, no sound. The forest was empty. I went back every day for 2 weeks. I called in sick to the hospital twice, which I had never done in my entire career. Barb drove down from Erie because I sounded so desperate on the phone that she thought I was having a breakdown. I couldn't tell her why. I couldn't tell her about the notes, the drawings, the correspondence. She would have had me committed. And then, on the morning of April 14th, 1995, I opened my back door to let the cat out, and Diane was standing in my backyard. Let me tell you what I saw, because I have relived this moment every day for 30 years, and every detail is cut into my memory with the permanence of a headstone. She was standing about 10 feet from the porch steps, on the grass, in full morning light. She was 28 years old. She had been gone for 9.5 years. She was wearing a garment made from animal hide that hung to her knees, belted with a strip of braided bark. Her feet were bare and so calloused they looked like leather. Her hair, which had been honey brown the last time I saw her, was streaked with gray and hung past her waist in a single matted braid. She was thin, ropey with muscle, and deeply tanned. Her hands were enormous, or seemed enormous, the hands of someone who had spent a decade gripping, climbing, digging, and carrying. There was a scar on her left forearm, long and white, that hadn't been there before. She was crying, silently, the way you cry when you've been crying for so long that sound is no longer part of it. The tears ran down her face and dripped off her jaw, and she didn't wipe them away. She just stood there, looking at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of someone who has crossed an ocean and isn't sure the shore they've reached is real. I said her name. Just her name. Diane. And she dropped to her knees on the grass and said, "Mom," and then I was off the porch and holding her, and we were both on the ground, tangled up in each other, and the cat was circling us and meowing because nobody had fed him, and the sun was coming through the trees the way it always does in April in Pennsylvania, indifferent and beautiful, and my daughter was home. We stayed like that for a long time. I don't know how long. Eventually, I got her inside, sat her at the kitchen table, the same table where her anatomy textbook had sat for 9 years before I finally put it away, and I made her coffee. She held the mug with both hands and stared at it like it was an artifact from another civilization. She took a sip and her eyes closed, and she said, "I forgot how good this is." And then she said, "I forgot a lot of things." The story of Diane's return emerged over days and weeks, not in one sitting. She couldn't talk about it continuously. She would speak for 20 or 30 minutes and then go silent, sometimes for hours, staring out the window at the tree line with an expression I eventually recognized as homesickness. Not for our house, for the forest. 9 years had made that forest her home, whether she wanted it or not, and the human world felt foreign and overwhelming in ways she struggled to articulate. The sound of the refrigerator motor kept her awake at night. The smell of dish soap made her nauseous. She couldn't eat cooked food for the first week, her stomach rejecting it violently. She slept on the floor, curled tight, because the bed felt dangerously soft and exposed. I took a leave of absence from the hospital to care for her. Barb came down and stayed. I told the sheriff's office that Diane had returned, and a deputy came out to take a statement. Diane told him she and her sister had gotten lost in the forest and survived in the wilderness for 9 years. She did not mention the creatures. She did not mention Connie's choice. She said Connie was still in the forest and didn't want to be found. The deputy looked at me, looked at Diane, and wrote it all down without expression. The official report classified Connie as a voluntary missing person and closed the case. That was the public version. The private version, the one Diane told me in the kitchen at night, after Barb had gone to bed, was infinitely more complicated. The group had moved. That was why the correspondence stopped. Gray had detected something, increased human activity in the area, possibly related to logging or simply a shift in the pattern he found concerning, and he had moved the group further north into the deep forest between Elk and Cameron counties, territory so remote that Diane described it as the edge of the map. The move had taken 3 weeks and covered nearly 30 miles, all of it off-trail, through terrain that even experienced woodsmen avoided. During the move, Diane had made her decision. She told Connie she was going to leave, not try to leave, not think about leaving, leave. She was going home. She was going to walk south until she hit a road, and she was going to flag down a vehicle, and she was going to sit in her mother's kitchen and drink coffee and sleep in a bed and be a human being again. Connie's response, as Diane recounted it, was quiet and immediate. She said, I know you need to go. And then she said the words that explain everything, the words that have lived in my chest like a second heartbeat for 30 years. She said, I'm not coming with you. This is my family now. I love you, but I belong here. Diane argued. She pleaded. She wept. She reminded Connie of everything she was giving up, her art, her education, her future, her mother, her own kind. Connie listened to all of it, and then she said something that Diane admitted she had no answer for. She said, I have never been this happy. Not one day of my life in Clearfield was I this happy. I'm sorry, Di, but this is where I'm supposed to be. The separation happened at dawn. The group was camped in a valley between 2 ridgelines, and Diane simply walked south, while the morning fog was still thick enough to obscure her from view. She expected Gray to follow her, to block her path the way he always had, but he didn't. Nobody followed her. She walked for 7 hours, mostly downhill, following a stream that eventually joined a larger creek that she recognized. By 2 in the afternoon, she was standing on the fire road behind our property, her feet bleeding and her legs shaking, and she walked the last mile home on pure momentum. I asked her why Gray didn't stop her this time. She was quiet for a long while, and then she said, I think Connie told him to let me go. I think she explained it to him, in their language, in a way he could understand, that I was sick with missing my world and that keeping me was causing me to wither. And he understood, because they understand love, Mom. That's the thing nobody will ever believe. They understand love better than most people I've met. The weeks after Diane's return were a wilderness of their own kind. I watched my daughter struggle to reintegrate into a world she had never expected to inhabit again. Simple things undid her. A television commercial made her flinch from the sudden noise and color. The fluorescent lights at the grocery store gave her migraines so severe she vomited in the parking lot. She couldn't wear shoes for 3 months because her feet, conditioned to bare earth and rock, screamed inside any enclosure. She had no social security card, no driver's license, no employment history, no educational record past her 2nd year of community college. Legally and bureaucratically, she was a ghost. The first time I ran a bath for her, she stood in the bathroom doorway and stared at the tub as if I'd asked her to climb into a coffin. She hadn't been submerged in heated water in nearly a decade. She bathed in streams, she told me later, cold water year-round, scrubbing with handfuls of sand and certain mosses that Big Mama showed her had mild antiseptic properties. The concept of hot water coming out of a wall through a metal pipe and filling a porcelain container struck her in that moment as the most absurd and extravagant thing she had ever witnessed. She did eventually get in. She sat in that tub for over an hour, adding hot water 3 times, and when she came out, her skin was raw and pink and she was shaking. not from cold, but from the sheer physical overwhelm of a sensation her body had forgotten was possible. Food was its own ordeal. Her digestive system had adapted to raw and minimally processed food over 9 years, and the salt, sugar, and fat content of even simple home-cooked meals made her violently ill for the first 2 weeks. I started her on plain rice, unseasoned broth, and raw vegetables, and we built from there, adding one element at a time the way you'd introduce solid food to an infant. Bread made her stomach cramp. Cheese was impossible for a month. Coffee, ironically, was the one thing her body accepted immediately, as if her cells remembered caffeine the way her mind remembered English, with instinctive recognition. She slept on the floor for the first 6 weeks, curled tight against the wall in the corner of her old bedroom, which I had kept exactly as she'd left it. The Cyndi Lauper poster still on the wall, the stuffed animals still on the shelf, the clock radio still set to the local country station. She told me the bed felt like drowning, too soft, too exposed, too far from the ground. In the forest, she had slept on packed earth or pine boughs, pressed against the warm bulk of another body, enclosed by the shelter walls and the sounds of the forest. My guest bedroom, with its box spring and cotton sheets and the hum of the baseboard heater, felt to her like floating in empty space. I called in every favor I'd accumulated in 3 decades at the hospital. A sympathetic doctor, Dave Moore, examined Diane without asking questions that went beyond the medical. Physically, she was remarkable. Muscle density and cardiovascular fitness that he said rivaled elite athletes, though she was vitamin deficient in several areas and had 2 cracked molars that needed attention. Psychologically was another matter entirely. Dave referred her to a therapist in State College, a woman named Joyce Klein who specialized in trauma survivors. Diane went to 3 sessions and stopped. She told me the therapist kept trying to frame her experience as captivity, and Diane said that wasn't accurate. She hadn't been a prisoner. She'd been a reluctant family member, and there was a difference that the therapist couldn't grasp, so the therapy couldn't reach her. Diane rebuilt her life the way you rebuild after a flood, starting with the foundation and working upward. She got new identification, eventually enrolled in a nursing program at Lock Haven, and became an LPN. She moved into a small apartment in town and took a position at the same hospital where I worked, which was both wonderful and surreal. Walking the halls I'd walked for 30 years, wearing scrubs instead of animal hide, her feet in shoes that she told me still felt like traps. She did not discuss the forest publicly. She did not talk about Connie. When people asked, and everyone asked because Clearfield remembers and Clearfield talks, Diane said her sister had chosen to live off the grid and that she respected Connie's decision. Most people accepted this, or at least stopped pressing. A few tried harder, and Diane shut them down with a look I recognized from Jim, the jaw set, the eyes flat, the conversation finished. But at night, in my kitchen, Diane shared everything. She told me about the hard winters when food was scarce and the group huddled together for warmth, bodies creating enough heat to survive temperatures that should have killed an unclothed human. The springs that erupted with life, when the young ones played in meadows, and Connie taught them to weave chains from wildflower stems. The summer storms that shook the mountains, and how Gray would position himself at the shelter's opening with his back to the wind, a living wall between his family and the weather. The autumn migrations when the group moved through the turning forest in single file, silent and deliberate, and the world blazed gold and copper around them. She told me about the births she'd witnessed and the death she'd mourned. An elderly female had passed in the winter of '91, and the others had carried her body to a rock outcropping overlooking the valley and arranged her facing east toward the sunrise. They visited the site for months afterward, sitting near her in silence, sometimes vocalizing in low, keening tones that Diane said were grief, pure and unmistakable. And she told me about Connie. Connie, who by 1995 was 26 years old and had spent more of her life in the forest than out of it. Connie, who had become a bridge between species, a translator whose presence had altered the group's relationship with the human world. She had convinced Gray to stop approaching human dwellings entirely. She had taught the younger ones to recognize and avoid human traps. She had created the cache site system with me, which required explaining to Gray the concept of a mother who was still searching, and Gray had understood because he was a father, and losing a child was the worst thing he could fathom. Connie was happy. Diane said it with a mix of wonder and bewilderment that never fully resolved. Connie woke up each morning with a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never had in Clearfield. She was an artist living inside her subject. The natural world was her canvas and her home, and she had chosen it with clear eyes and a full heart. She missed me. Diane assured me of this. But she did not miss the world. She had traded it for something she valued more, and she had never expressed regret. I'm 80 years old now. I still live in the same house in Clearfield. Diane lives 10 minutes away and visits every Sunday for dinner. She's 59, works part-time at a clinic in Phillipsburg, and has the kind of quiet competence that makes her essential to everyone around her. She never married. I asked her about it once, and she said, "I spent a decade in a family that wasn't my species, and it functioned better than most human families I've observed. I'm not sure what that says about me, but I don't feel the need to test it." Connie is 56. I know this the way I know the seasons, as a fact of the natural world that persists whether I witness it directly or not. I still go to the cache site, though less often now because my knees protest, and the hike is long. I still leave notes. I still find responses, though they arrive less frequently. The birch bark drawings have given way to small carvings in wood, intricate and breathtaking, depicting scenes from a life I can only imagine. Connie's artistic gift has not diminished. If anything, it has deepened into something that would astonish the world if anyone besides me ever held these pieces. I keep them in a box under my bed. 40 years of communication, drawings, carvings, photographed arrangements of objects. It is the most complete record of sustained human contact with an unidentified primate species ever assembled. And it will never be published, never be studied, never be submitted to any institution. Not because I doubt it would reshape our understanding of the natural world, because I know it would destroy the world I'm trying to protect. If science confirmed these creatures existed in central Pennsylvania, the consequences would be immediate and catastrophic. Researchers would descend, media would swarm, then hunters, opportunists, developers, government agencies with agendas. The forest would be carved up, surveilled, and made hostile to the very beings who have called it home for longer than our species has had a name for this continent. Gray's family and whatever other groups move through those mountains would be pursued, captured, studied, exhibited, and ultimately eliminated, the way we have eliminated every wild thing we've ever found interesting enough to chase. I refuse to be the person who sets that in motion, and neither will Diane. So this recording is what remains. My story, told because I'm 80 and my body is reminding me daily that time is not infinite and someone should know the truth. Not the world, not the press, just someone. You, listening right now, wherever you are. You should know that there are things in those forests that our maps don't account for, and the right response to that mystery is not pursuit. It is reverence. My daughter Connie grasped that at 16. She walked into the trees and recognized something that most of us spend our entire lives failing to see. That the natural world is not a backdrop for human ambition. It is a community, a family, a home that was ancient before the first town was built, and will endure long after the last one crumbles. And some of us, the rare ones, the ones whose hearts are tuned to a frequency most people can't detect, find their place in it. I used to pray for Connie to come home. I knelt beside my bed every night for years, the way my mother taught me, asking God to bring my baby back. But somewhere around the 10th year, my prayer changed. I stopped asking God to return her and started asking God to watch over her, because Connie was home. She'd been home since the moment she stepped into that forest and heard a sound that reached a part of her I had never been able to touch. She found her people. They just weren't people. Diane visits every Sunday. We eat dinner, watch the evening news, and sometimes, after the kitchen is clean and the house is quiet, she tells me a story from those years. A funny one, usually. The time a juvenile male ate a porcupine and spent 2 days whimpering while Big Mama pulled quills from his swollen tongue. The time Connie tried to teach Gray to draw, and he held the stick so carefully in his massive hand, as if it might shatter, and produced a single deliberate line in the dirt, and looked at Connie with such earnest pride that both sisters laughed until their ribs ached. The way the little ones piled on top of each other in their sleep, a heap of limbs and fur and warmth that Diane said resembled a basket of puppies, except each one weighed 80 pounds. These stories are the closest I get to Connie now. They're filtered through Diane's practical eye, softened by time and repetition, but they keep her alive for me. They keep her real. My daughter, the artist, the dreamer, the girl who wanted to draw for National Geographic, found something greater than illustration. She found the real thing. She found a world nobody else has documented, and she chose to inhabit it with all its hardship and danger and staggering beauty. I don't have much time left. My doctor communicates in that measured way physicians use when the prognosis is poor and the patient is old enough to read between the lines. Barb passed 4 years ago. Jim has been gone more than 40 years. But my girls are alive, both of them, and that is more than I allowed myself to hope during those black years when the forest returned only silence. Last month, I made the hike to the Cache site for what I suspect will be the final time. My knees barely carried me. The walk that once took 45 minutes required 3 hours, but I reached it, and I left my note, the kind I always leave, telling Connie about the weather, the garden, what Diane had been doing, the small details of a life that exists just 3 miles from the extraordinary one my daughter chose. When I returned 2 days later, my note was gone. In its place was a carving, the most detailed one Connie has ever made. It depicted 3 figures, 2 human women, one tall and one smaller, standing on either side of a much larger figure. The taller human had her hand extended toward the shorter one, and the shorter one was reaching back. Between them, the large figure stood with its arms around both, holding them together across the distance. I understood it immediately. It meant what the drawings have always meant, from the first scratched birch bark to this final carved piece of wood. It meant family. It meant love persisting across every boundary that the world places between the people who share it. It meant that the 3 miles of forest and the 40 years of separation were real, but also beside the point. The point was the reaching. The point was that none of us ever stopped. I brought the carving home and placed it in the box with all the others. Then I sat on the porch and watched the tree line until the sun dropped behind the ridgeline and the first stars appeared. The same stars that shine over Connie tonight wherever she sleeps. The same stars that have kept watch over that forest since long before any human being drew breath on this continent. She's out there, my girl, my Connie, living a life that defies everything the modern world considers possible, in a family that science insists cannot exist, in a home that most people will never glimpse, even in their most unguarded dreams. And she chose to stay, not because she doesn't love me. The carvings testify to that, 40 years of communication across species and silence and forest testify to that. She loves me the way a river loves the ocean it moves toward, constantly, inevitably, but from a distance that cannot close without destroying what makes the river itself. Connie is a river. She always was. And I have finally, after all these decades, found peace in the fact that I cannot hold a river in my hands. I can only stand on the bank and watch it go and be thankful that it passes close enough for me to hear it sing. That's the end of my story. Not because there's nothing left, but because the part that belongs to me has been told. The rest is Connie's and the forests, and the creatures whose existence I have guarded for 40 years with everything I possess. If you believe me, I'm grateful. If you don't, I understand. I wouldn't have believed it either once. Before my daughters walked into the trees, and only one came back. My name is Carol Dawson. I'm a retired nurse from Clearfield, Pennsylvania. I had 2 daughters, and I loved them both beyond language, beyond reason, beyond the borders of the world I thought I inhabited. One of them came home. The other found a different home, a wilder one, an older one, a home that existed before roads and towns and all the structures we built to persuade ourselves that we are alone on this earth. We are not alone, and the ones who share this world with us deserve the same thing every living creature wants: to be left in peace with their families, in the place where they belong, under the stars that have never once judged any of us for the choices we've made or the lives we've chosen to live. Connie made her choice. I've made mine, and now you know.